In 2001, the UK National Census recorded that 1 in 20 Londoners were of black African descent, and it's a figure that's continued to rise in the years since. Modern British life and culture now have a strong African component. It's a development that's merely the latest chapter in the history of relations between Africa and Western Europe. And in that long and turbulent history, the Benin bronzes, as they used to be known, hold a unique place. Benin plaques are actually made of brass, not bronze. They reach about the size of an A3 sheet of paper, and they show figures in high relief that celebrate the battles won by the army of the Benin ruler, the Oba, and the rituals of the Oba's court. They're not only great works of art and triumphs of metal casting, they're also documents of two quite distinct moments of Euro-African contact. The first, peaceful and commercial, the second, bloody.
This was really our first notable encounter with the European world. People who came in looking for trading partners, looking for expansion of their own knowledge of the world, and being astonished to encounter this society.
A history of the world in 100 objects. The Oba of Benin with Europeans. A brass plaque cast in Nigeria during the 16th century.
Throughout this week, we're with objects that describe how Europe first encountered and then traded with the wider world in the 16th century. But the magnificent sculptures of this programme record the encounter from the other side, from the African side. They offer us a remarkable picture of the structure of this West African kingdom. Their main subject is the glorification of the ruler of Benin, the Oba, and of his prowess as hunter and soldier. But they also tell us how the people of Benin saw their first European trading partners. The plaque I've chosen is dominated by the majestic figure of the Oba himself. The plaque is about 2 feet square. Its colour strikes you as coppery rather than brassy, and there are 5 figures on it, 3 Africans and 2 Europeans. In the centre, in the proudest relief and looking straight out at us, is the Oba. He's on his throne, wearing a high helmet-like crown. His neck is completely invisible. A series of large rings runs from his shoulder right the way up to his lower lip. In his right hand, he holds up a ceremonial axe. To either side of the Oba kneel 2 court functionaries, dressed very like him, but with plainer headdresses and fewer neck rings. They wear belts hung with small crocodile heads, and these were the emblem of those authorized to conduct business with the Europeans. And the Europeans are present, or at least part of them. Against the patterned background, we can see floating the heads and shoulders of 2 tiny Europeans. The Europeans shown are Portuguese, who were sailing down the west coast of Africa in their ocean-going galleons on their way to the Indies. But they were also seriously interested in West African pepper, ivory and gold. They were the first Europeans to arrive by sea in West Africa, and their ships astonished the local inhabitants. Until now, any trade between West Africa and Europe had been conducted through a series of middlemen, with goods carried across the Sahara by camel. The Portuguese galleons cut out all the middlemen and offered a totally new kind of trading opportunity. Their ships carried gold and ivory direct to Europe, and in return brought back larger quantities of European brass than had ever before reached West Africa. This was the raw material which enabled the Benin plaques to be made in the quantities they were. After the initial arrival of the Portuguese around 1470, the Dutch and the English followed shortly after. All European visitors were struck by the Oba's position as both the spiritual and the secular head of his kingdom. Like this music, the Benin brass plaques are principally concerned with praising the Oba. They were nailed to the walls of his palace, rather in the same way as tapestries in a European context, and they allowed the visitor to admire both the achievements of the ruler and the wealth of the kingdom. The overall effect was enthusiastically described in detail by an early Dutch visitor.
The king's court is square, It is divided into many magnificent palaces, houses and apartments of the courtiers, and comprises beautiful and long square galleries, about as large as the Exchange at Amsterdam, from top to bottom covered with cast copper, on which are engraved the pictures of their war exploits and battles, and are kept very clean.
In short, Europeans visiting Benin in the 15th and 16th century discovered a society every bit as organised and structured as the great courts of Europe, with an administration able to control all aspects of life, and not least foreign trade. Because of their ocean-going ships, the Europeans could provide commodities from all over the world that were greatly valued by the Oba's court. Coral from the Mediterranean, cowrie shells from the Indian Ocean to serve as money, cloth brought from the Far East, and, from Europe itself, the massive amounts of copper and brass needed for the metal casting. The court of Benin was, in fact, a thoroughly international place, and this is one aspect of the Benin plaques that fascinates the Nigerian-born sculptor Sokari Douglas Camp.
The Oba has a certain amount of rings on his neck, and even when you see sort of contemporary pictures of the Oba, he has more coral rings than anybody else, and his chest piece has more coral on it. Conversation has always been very important to me. We have things that are supposed to be totally traditional, yet they're traditional through trade.
The brass needed to make the plaques was usually transported in the form of large bracelets, manias in Portuguese, and the quantities involved are staggering. In 1548, just one German merchant house agreed to provide Portugal with 432 tons of brass manias for the West African market. When we look again at the plaque, we can see that one of the Europeans is indeed holding a mania, and this is the key to the whole scene. The Oba is with the officials who manage and control the European trade. The three Africans are in the foreground, and they're on a far bigger scale than the diminutive Europeans, both of whom are shown with long hair and elaborate feathered hats. In fact, they look both feeble and ridiculous. The mania makes it clear that the brass brought from Europe is merely the raw material from which the Benin craftsmen would create great works of art like this one. What we're looking at is, in fact, a document that demonstrates that the whole process of the trade in brass was controlled by the Africans. And part of that control was a total prohibition on the export of the finished brass plaques. So although carved ivories were exported from Benin in the 16th century and were well known in Europe, the Benin plaques were reserved to the Oba himself, and they were not allowed to leave the country. None had been seen in Europe before 1897. On the 13th of January 1897, the London Times announced news of a Benin disaster. A British delegation seeking to enter Benin City during an important religious ceremony had been attacked and some of its members killed. The details of what actually happened are still far from clear, and they've been vigorously disputed. But whatever the real facts, the British, in ostensible revenge for the killing, organised a punitive expedition which raided Benin City, exiled the Oba, and created the British Protectorate of southern Nigeria. The booty from the attack on Benin included carved ivory tusks, coral jewellery, and hundreds of bronze statues and plaques. Many of these objects were then auctioned off to cover the costs of the expedition, and they were bought by museums across the world. The arrival and reception of these completely unknown sculptures caused a sensation in Europe. It's not too much to say that they changed European understanding of African history. One of the first people to encounter the plaques and to recognise their quality and their significance was the British Museum curator Charles Hercules Reed.
It need scarcely be said that at the first sight of these remarkable works of art, we were at once astounded at such an unexpected find, and puzzled to account for so highly developed an art among a race so entirely barbarous.
Many wild theories were put forward. The plaques must have come from ancient Egypt, or perhaps the people of Benin were one of the lost tribes of Israel. The sculptures must have derived from European influence. After all, these were the contemporaries of Michelangelo, Donatello and Cellini. But in fact, research quickly established that the Benin plaques were entirely West African creations, made without European influence. It's a bewildering fact that the early, broadly harmonious relationship between Europeans and West Africans, established in the 16th century, had, by 1900, almost completely disappeared from European memory. Most of Europe had simply forgotten that they had once admired the court of the Oba of Benin. Why this strange amnesia? I think it's probably because the later relationship was so dominated by the transatlantic slave trade, with all its dehumanizing implications. Later still, there would be the great European scramble for Africa, in which the punitive expedition of 1897 was merely one bloody incident. That raid, and the removal of some of Benin's great artworks, may have spread knowledge of Benin's culture to the world, but it left a wound in the consciousness of many Nigerians, a wound that's still felt keenly today, as Wole Soyinka, the Nigerian poet and playwright, describes.
When I see a Benin bronze, I immediately think of the mastery of technology and art, the welding of the two. I think immediately of a cohesive ancient civilization. It increases a sense of self-esteem, because it makes you understand that African society actually produced some great civilizations, established some great cultures, and today it contributes to one's sense of the degradation that has overtaken many African societies, to the extent that we forget that we were once a functioning people before the negative incursion of foreign powers. The looted objects are still till today politically loaded. The Benin bronze, like other artifacts, is still very much part of the politics of contemporary Africa and, of course, Nigeria in particular.
The Benin plaques, these beautiful and disturbing objects, speak as powerfully today as they did when they first arrived in Europe 100 years ago. To many, they're not only supreme sculptures, but a reminder that in the 16th century, Europe and Africa were able to deal with each other on equal terms. In America, at the same time, the situation was quite different. There, the terms of engagement between the local inhabitants and the European intruders were profoundly unequal.
These aren't carvings. They're 16th century casts in copper-rich alloys of brass and bronze. Over 900 plaques are thought to have been made. To produce each one, the artist would need to know how to make and fire a clay mold, and how to melt the metals to pour into it. It's an incredibly difficult skill to master. The combination of relatively sophisticated science and artistic accomplishment baffled most European 19th century observers. They couldn't believe that so-called primitives had been capable of producing work of the same standard as their European contemporaries. These amazing objects just didn't match the Europeans' view of West Africans. The questions were, where did they get the technology to develop this amazing bronze work, and where did they find the materials? But the clues to how such artifacts were manufactured are there for the finding, and I think they will reveal much about the West African kingdoms that created them. I want to know why they were made, what they mean, and what that tells us about the time and place they were produced. And there are some symbols that seem to reoccur: the leopard, the snake, the crocodile, so obviously they were very important. I want to find out what they mean and why they were so important to these people. These recurring images remind me of the symbolic motifs in Renaissance art. I think they carry hidden layers of meaning beyond the understanding of the imperialistic Brits. So what do the bronzes tell us about the Kingdom of Benin and its power and its culture? And what does the technology required to make them tell us about pre-colonial West Africa? I'll travel to modern-day Nigeria where the Kingdom of Benin reached its height in the 16th century. And I'll reach even further back in time and explore a panoply of ancient cities and kingdoms in West Africa, founded many centuries before Benin. I look for evidence in what's now Mali of how ancient culture and technologies made Benin and its bronzes possible. The centre of power of the Kingdom of Benin was Benin City. Today it's one of Nigeria's thriving cities, home to over 1 million Africans. The main circle in the centre is dotted with statues, public art depicting Benin's history. For 600 years, until the late 19th century, it dominated this part of West Africa. But the kingdom's former scale and power are not immediately obvious, unless you know where to look. Dr. Ekigusa Isian, author of several books on Benin's history, is taking me to see a 500-year-old feat of engineering. At the kingdom's height in the 16th century, a series of moats and earthen walls protected the city and its surrounding land.
It was a defensive system that consisted of a ditch and then a rampart.
What little survives is overgrown and barely recognizable. But archaeologists have found evidence of a vast network of trenches and walls up to 9 meters high. They zigzagged around the city area for an incredible 4,000 miles.
Benin really was the capital of this part of Africa. That is the eastern part of the west coast of Africa. Benin was the principal town. It was an important center of the culture of this part of Africa. It was an important center of the political reach along this huge area of the eastern portion of the west coast of Africa.
The kingdom was governed from a vast palace by a hereditary ruler, the Oba. And his subjects were animists, believers in the idea that souls and spirits existed not only in humans, but in animals, plants, and the earth itself. At its height, it exerted political, military, and economic control over an area stretching almost 40,000 square miles. In the 19th century, the British saw the kingdom as an opportunity to extend their influence in Africa. They established a trade agreement, but when Benin reneged on it, relations deteriorated. A British delegation ignored warnings not to approach the Oba and were massacred, leaving just 2 survivors from over 200 people. A month later, in February 1897, 1,200 British soldiers arrived in response. The city walls didn't stop the British punitive expedition, and the city was razed to the ground. At the royal palace, they found artwork that they couldn't believe had been created by Africans. Around 2,000 pieces were taken, sold, and distributed to Western museums. The Oba was deposed and died in exile. It was a catastrophic defeat for the Kingdom of Benin, but that's not the impression you get from the modern monument in the center of the city. It shows a Benin warrior standing victorious over his dead and dying British enemies.
And I actually see it as a triumph of narrative, that we will continue as a nation whatever. Ultimately, it tells the story of a victorious nation, victorious in the sense that it proudly tells its stories, whether it's in the Benin bronzes or whether it's in monuments like this today.
In Benin, it seems history isn't written by the victors, it's written by the artists. And the Kingdom of Benin disappeared only for a short time. In 1914, the British restored the monarchy to Benin City to help administer their Nigerian colony, and a modest palace was rebuilt. The traditions of the kingdom that have survived are maintained from an enclave in the city centre. I've been granted a royal audience, an opportunity to attend the Oba's court, where hereditary and appointed chiefs gather each day. When His Royal Majesty the Oba of Benin enters, the chiefs greet him with "God save the King." This is more than a symbolic institution. The Oba and his chiefs rule on issues brought to them by ordinary people. Their judgment carries authority here, and the kingdom exists in parallel with the Nigerian state. With a leopard at the Oba's feet and standard bearers at his side, it's like one of the Benin bronzes come to life. This is the kind of occasion he believes the plaques were designed to mark.
Those bronzes were not made for museum pieces. Initially, in the absence of photography and writing, they were made to depict, illustrate events in the palace or in the community or some festivals. That's why you see them. They were made as in the absence of photography. That's what they were meant for initially. Yes.
And how important are the bronze casters, the smiths, the people who actually make these objects?
They are a guild of a royal guild, specifically to be doing this thing in the olden days.
The Bronze Casters Guild exists today. Their main business is tourist souvenirs, but the makers are still an exclusive group of craftsmen with high social status. Membership of the Royal Guild is hereditary. Ikpongwusa Ine's family have been bronze casters for as long as anyone can remember. And the skills that created the 16th century bronzes are still evident today.
It's liquid, it's now liquid now. You can see the flame.
The process begins with a simple clay shape to act as a core.
So then you cover the core with wax?
With wax. Then you start your details, the mouth, the nose, the eye.
And then you cover it
with the mud.
With the mud?
This is the soft mud which we use in covering them. So you cover the whole with the mud, soft mud, after the designing.
The details in the wax will leave their impression on the clay mud. When the object is heated, the clay will harden and the wax will melt and drain out. Molten metal will fill the space left by the wax.
Inside the fire is like this pot, and with this scrap metal, you load this pot.
In the 16th century, the craftsmen melted down copper bracelets brought by Portuguese traders to create brass and bronze. Nowadays, any metal seems to do.
So you can put something like a car area
it's scrap metal.
Yeah.
Then you put them in here. Then I put it inside the fire here.
In the furnace, the assortment of metal melts at around 1,000 degrees Celsius.
So you don't waste anything.
Ikpong Musa has some molds that have been fired, and the melted wax has been drained away. Now the molten metal can be poured in.
It's just amazing to think that these processes haven't changed for hundreds of years.
No, it doesn't change.
But the thing is, it still feels totally relevant as well.
Very. The same way in 100 years ago, the same way today. The same processes from one stage to another, from one stage to another, is the same process.
And in terms of the relevance, is it still there? Do people still feel these are important?
Very. We have more than 100 and something members of bronze casters along the streets.
Really?
Walking.
And they still feel...
And the junior ones are still coming up.
Really? And they feel connected to the Oba and the Royal Palace?
Yes.
Yes. So those old stories and traditions, they're as important to you as they ever were to your ancestors?
It remains this year, next year, and forever.
Forevermore?
Yeah.
They need to understand pottery, metallurgy, and have artistic ability. And the same skills would have been required 500 years ago to cast the Benin bronzes, something the Victorians could hardly believe.
Oh, I'm beginning to see what it is now. It's hands praying.
It's a prayer hand.
I see.
It's a prayer hand.
A Christian ornament which has been created using a centuries-old technique. For me, these objects don't reach the standards of the 16th century bronzes. But these are for the tourist rather than for the royal palace. Reminders of the quality craftsmanship once commissioned by the king now lie in Benin City Museum. These are, sadly, mostly replicas of bronzes that were taken from here in 1897. But even so, I'm struck once again by the intricacy of these objects.
It's always the detail that shocks me when I look at these Benin plaques. I mean, the whole thing is very much like a historical document as much as a piece of art. I mean, this is depicting very particular people, and you can imagine them in all of their finery, because you can see it actually depicted here, the detail of the textiles, the layered textiles that they're wearing.
Many bronzes depict 16th century obas, and they are records of specific events, such as military victories which expanded the kingdom.
This, for me, will be Oba Essegy returning from fighting the Agana triumphant with his retinue.
Oba Essegy bolstered the kingdom with the help of the Portuguese, who provided weapons and mercenaries for battles. Many of the plaques were made during his reign. The Portuguese also brought the metal, which enabled the bronze casters to immortalize his exploits. But this craft predates the arrival of the Portuguese, so there must have been another source of copper for the bronzesmiths. And while the bronzes were records of the kingdom's histories, I think they were also more than that. I want to find the origin and meaning of the symbols depicted in them, like this magnificent leopard and the snake which appears on the roof of the Oba's palace. I also want to find out how the culture and technology spread. The answer may lie in West Africa's dynamic and lost civilizations. For 1,000 years before the rise of Benin.
You also talk about, the Benin Kingdom having changed very little. Is there a particular pride that must be there in the area because of that?
Yes, Benin is known all over the world as the strongest traditional people. They are still very traditional. They keep all their laws. All the things that went back in 14th, 13th century, they are still in place.
I'd just like to say that, in Nigeria, during the period she was talking about, there were, Nigeria was divided into various regions. You had the Sokoto Caliphate, the northern part of Nigeria, which is predominantly Hausas and Nupes. And you had Benin Kingdom was in the Midwestern region. The person who founded the Warring Kingdom was, a prince, from the Benin Kingdom that moved away during the period that there were intertribal and civil wars within that kingdom. He moved away, for his safety, and his followers moved with him, traveled along the coastal region and settled in the present-day Warri area, and he founded that Benin. So there were different kingdoms at that time. The Benin people, the Benin Kingdom was a very prominent and powerful kingdom, and the Benin Kingdom has retained most of its, cultural values, both in terms of religious symbols, what the kingship meant to the people. They are still a strong unifying force there between, the kingship, the kingdom, the Obas, and the people that they represent, because the Oba was a very powerful ruler, not just politically, but spiritually. The Benin people were known craftsmen. They were very good craftsmen and good brass work. And most of the artifacts, a lot of the artifacts that were carted away from Nigeria, and brought to the museums, which we find in different parts of Europe and America today, actually, most of this came from the Benin Kingdom, the Benin and